Spring awakened the hills above the Bosphorus as Emperor Constantine stood where Asia and Europe nearly touched, surveying a landscape that would soon become the stage for one of history's greatest transformations. He gazed upon the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. Its modest fortifications and weathered temples bore the patina of 7 centuries, the marks of time and decline. Yet, before him, Constantine saw beyond this present reality to a grander vision, a Rome reborn that would outlast the marble monuments of the eternal city itself. Born of both pragmatism and prophecy, his decision to establish his seat here reflected the empire's changing center of gravity. Rome had grown unwieldy, its senators too steeped in pagan tradition, its people too attached to the old gods. Real wealth now lay eastward, in Egyptian grain, Chinese silk, and Indian spices. At this narrow strait, where the Black Sea met the Mediterranean, where caravans from Persia encountered ships from Greece, Constantine would build not merely another urban center, but the beating heart of a Christian empire. Ceremonies, both ancient and revolutionary, accompanied the beginning of construction. On the 11th of May 330, Constantine traced out fortifications that would encompass 7 hills, in conscious imitation of Rome, where Roman priests had once sacrificed to Jupiter and Mars. Christian bishops blessed the foundations with holy water and sacred relics. Above construction sites where thousands labored to realize their sovereign's dream, and flying above them all was the Labaron, the key rose standard that had appeared to Constantine in his vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Hey there, I'm glad you're here. In today's video, we will walk through the timeline of the history of Constantinople, exploring its rise, its golden age, and its eventual fall. It's a fascinating journey through one of the world's most iconic cities. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you enjoy this deep dive into history, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new video. Let's get started. In the spring of 330 CE, Emperor Constantine, a ruler forged in the fires of civil war and prophecy, stood gazing across the strait that divided the known world. Before him stretched Byzantium, a city of modest walls and crumbling temples, nestled between 2 great continents, Asia and Europe. The land itself seemed timeless, as though waiting for a new age to unfold. But for Constantine, this was not just a city, it was a symbol, a canvas on which he would paint his grandest vision. The Bosphorus Strait was no mere stretch of water. It was the natural bridge between East and West, the lifeblood that connected the ancient world with the emerging forces of the Christian Empire Constantine dreamed of building. The waterway itself had witnessed the rise and fall of many civilizations: Greek, Roman, Persian, each recognizing its value as the heart of commerce, military strategy, and culture. But in Constantine's eyes, this landscape carried a deeper meaning. He had heard whispers of divine prophecy, of visions that spoke of a city that would serve as the new Rome, not merely as a seat of political power, but as the spiritual center of a unified Christian world. As he stood before this monumental decision, the geography of Byzantium offered a natural advantage that no other city in the empire could boast. The city's harbors, the Golden Horn to the north, the Sea of Marmara to the south, and the Bosphorus to the east, formed an almost impenetrable defense. But it wasn't just the geography that spoke to him. It was the strategic significance. Byzantium was not merely a place in the empire, it was the gateway to the east, the ultimate control point for trade and defense. From China's silk to India's spices, to the grain of Egypt, The wealth of the known world passed through the Bosphorus. Whoever ruled here, Constantine realized, controlled the very pulse of the ancient world. But Constantine's decision was not simply about geography or trade routes. His eyes were set on something greater. The Roman Empire, long divided and stretched thin, had grown unmanageable. Its political and spiritual heart in Rome had begun to decay, weakened by corruption, civil unrest, and the fading grip of the pagan traditions that had once bound the empire together. Constantine understood that Rome's ancient ways were no longer enough to unify his people. The empire needed something new, something that could transcend the pagan past and lead into the Christian future. The city of Byzantium was symbolic not only for its strategic location, but also for its spiritual potential. Constantine, deeply influenced by a vision he had witnessed before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, believed that God himself had chosen this land as the foundation for the new Christian capital. In a world torn by religious strife, Christianity would become the glue that would bind the empire together, and Byzantium, soon to be named Constantinople, would rise as its center. On May 11, 330 CE, as Constantine walked the boundaries of his future city, he was not simply laying the foundation for a capital, he was laying the foundation for an empire's rebirth. His actions would not only shape the fate of the Roman world, but would influence the course of world history for centuries. The founding of Constantinople was not just about military power or about wealth, it was about legacy. The ancient city of Byzantium, with its ruins and temples, had already withstood the tides of time, but under Constantine's hand, it would become a city that defied time itself. A city where faith and power would intertwine to create a beacon of civilization. It was a city that would witness the rise of great empires and their eventual fall. Byzantium had once been a quiet city, but in the hands of Constantine, it was transformed into Constantinople, the city of Constantine, the eternal center of the Christian world. The name itself, the city's very foundation, was a testament to his vision. A city designed to last, to outlive the crumbling Rome of his youth. Where Rome had been a fading monument to the gods of the past, Constantinople would be a shining example of the future. A future ruled by the Christian faith. A faith that Constantine would champion. But even as the city's walls began to rise, the winds of history were already shifting. Beyond the Bosphorus, a new world was emerging, one that would challenge the very foundation of Constantinople. The Persians were pressing on the eastern frontiers. The barbarians were advancing toward the empire's northern borders. And the Christianity Constantine embraced was still a faith at odds with the old Roman gods. Yet, Constantine's belief in prophecy and his divine purpose would propel the city to unparalleled heights. In the spring of 330 CE, Emperor Constantine stood at the crossroads of history. Before him, the winds of change were already blowing, sweeping across the ancient lands of Byzantium. He could feel it in the air, the weight of destiny pressing upon his shoulders. His decision was not made lightly. It was the result of years of political strife, personal belief, and divine guidance. He had fought hard to unite the Roman Empire, and now it was time to secure its future, time to establish a new capital that would embody the union of the old world and the new. The Bosphorus Strait, the natural barrier between Europe and Asia, had long been the lifeblood of commerce and military strategy. But for Constantine, it was more than that. It was the very gateway to the future. Byzantium, a city once founded by the Greeks and now ruled by the Romans, had stood as a quiet testament to a past long gone. Its walls, weathered by centuries of conflict, seemed no match for the burgeoning ambitions of an empire in flux. Yet, in these ruins, Constantine saw something that others had failed to notice: potential, vast and untapped. On May 11th, 330 CE, he formally declared Byzantium as the new capital of the Roman Empire, rechristened it Constantinople, and marked the beginning of a transformation that would echo through the annals of time. This was not a mere relocation of power. It was an act of empire building, a visionary leap into the future. The emperor's hand, steady and resolute, marked the first line of the city's new boundaries. Here, amid this rugged terrain, would rise a new center of power, a shining beacon of Christianity in a world still divided by the remnants of paganism. The symbolism was not lost on Constantine. Just as Rome's foundation was steeped in the divine, an epic of myth and prophecy, so too would be Constantinople's. But this new city, this new capital, would not be ruled by the old gods of Rome. No, this was a Christian empire, and Constantine was its divine appointed ruler, chosen by God himself. For Constantine, the city's very foundation was a sacred act, a statement that Christianity was not just a religion, but the bedrock of imperial power. It was fitting, then, that the very act of construction was accompanied by Christian rites, anointed with holy water and sanctified by bishops. As they blessed the land, they were laying the foundation not just for a city, but for a legacy that would last beyond the pages of history. Architectural grandeur followed close behind. The design of Constantinople was an embodiment of the imperial spirit, a fusion of the past and the future, of Roman strength and Christian faith. The city's great avenue, which would eventually stretch from the Golden Gate to the Forum of Constantine, mirrored the grandeur of Rome's forums. But now they were drenched in Christian symbolism. Where once Roman emperors had walked beneath statues of Jupiter and Mars, Constantine would walk under the auspices of Christ, with a Christian cross flying proudly overhead. One of the first monuments to rise was the Column of Constantine, a towering structure carved from Egyptian porphyry. It stood not just as a physical marker, but as a statement. Constantinople was Constantine's creation, divinely sanctioned and eternally bound to the emperor's vision. The Roman columns, familiar from the great architecture of the past, found a new home here, in a city that sought to combine the old with the new. But these columns were not just architectural flourishes. They symbolized the bridge between the imperial traditions of Rome and the emerging Christian future. To the people of Constantinople, the columns would stand as reminders that the city was not just a home for the empire. It was the spiritual center of the world. Constantine's great palace, designed to house not only the emperor, but also the court and the administrative elite, rose to dominate the skyline. It wasn't just a palace, it was an empire in miniature. For those who walked through its halls, it would be a reminder of the immense power that Constantine had wielded, not just through military might, but through the religious authority that the new city represented. The Hippodrome, where chariot races once divided the people's loyalties, became a new space for imperial spectacle. Its vast size symbolized the greatness of the new city and the empire it represented. But what made this transformation possible were the thousands of people, laborers, architects, craftsmen, and merchants who toiled day and night, constructing Constantinople's bones. The laborers, often drawn from all corners of the empire, worked tirelessly, their sweat staining the stones that would forever hold the city's foundations. It was through their efforts that Constantinople began to take form, not just in marble and stone, but in the lives that were shaped by the city's very creation. It was a collective endeavor, one that reflected both the visionary power of Constantine and the sacrifice of the people who worked under him. Merchants, too, began to flood the new capital, seeing in it an opportunity for trade and wealth. Constantinople became a crossroads of culture and commerce, a place where East met West, where silks and spices mingled with Roman goods, where every transaction helped to establish the city's prosperity. As Constantinople grew, so did its power. It was not just a political seat. It was the economic heart of the Byzantine Empire. The construction of Constantinople was an act of divine ambition, a vision realized in stone and faith. For Constantine, it was more than the founding of a city. It was the creation of an empire's future, an empire that would stand at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, an empire that would define the Christian world for centuries to come. Constantinople was not just a city, it was a statement, a new world emerging from the wreckage of the old. As the Byzantine Empire began to take root on the banks of the Bosphorus, the very foundation of the city became a symbol of both divine destiny and imperial will. From the moment Constantine's vision was set into motion, the city's growth was impossible to ignore, as it attracted not only Roman legions and merchant caravans, but also the energies of a newly Christianized world. Constantinople was to become a melting pot, a fusion of everything that had come before, woven together with strands of the new Christian faith that Constantine had so passionately championed. Byzantium, once a quiet city, had now been reimagined by Constantine's ambition. May 11th, 330 CE marked the formal birth of Constantinople. But what did the early years of this new city look like? What force drove its rapid expansion and metamorphosis? The city became a cosmopolitan beacon, welcoming people from all corners of the Roman world. Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, Jews, Armenians, and more, each bringing their own cultural, economic, and religious practices. Constantinople was no longer just a Roman outpost. It was the cradle of a new civilization, one that transcended traditional boundaries and blended Greek philosophy, Roman governance, Christian theology, and Eastern mysticism. With the grand construction projects underway, Constantine's capital rapidly became a beacon of culture and trade. Merchants from India and China walked the same streets as Greek philosophers and Christian bishops. The city's position, strategically placed at the crossroads of East and West, became a vital hub of commerce and ideas, where goods from spices to silks, gold to grain, passed through its gates. The air was thick with the scent of incense and leather, the marketplace alive with a clash of languages, an experience that could only be described as both chaotic and enriching. In the heart of it all stood the great palace of Constantinople. This magnificent structure was not only a symbol of imperial authority, but a testament to the power of the Christian faith that had taken root in the city. Built on the orders of Constantine, the palace had its own chapels, altars, and sacred spaces, imposing structures that reflected the new religious order of the empire. Roman columns, Greek statues, and Egyptian obelisks, each from different parts of the empire, were meticulously assembled to form the iconic architecture that would define Constantinople for centuries to come. But it wasn't just the palace's splendor that shaped the city's culture. It was the role of faith, the way in which Christianity began to define not just the spiritual landscape, but the cultural identity of the city. In the streets below, the common people of Constantinople, men and women of diverse origins, were affected just as deeply by the religious transformation as the emperor himself. Constantine's decision to promote Christianity had a profound effect on the city. What had once been a pagan city, with remnants of Roman polytheism scattered across its monuments and temples, was now a city increasingly shaped by Christian thought and practice. Churches sprang up alongside Roman forums, and Christian bishops, who now held unprecedented power, began to wield influence not only over spiritual matters, but in matters of imperial governance as well. As the bishops and priests performed religious rituals, they began to lay their own mark on the city's landscape. The Church of the Holy Apostles, which Constantine had commissioned, became the spiritual heart of the city, while the Hagia Sophia, erected by later emperors, would stand as the epitome of Christian architecture. The mosaic-decked walls, towering domes, and intricate iconography spoke not just of faith, but of imperial grandeur, and of a city that was both the center of Christian devotion and the seat of imperial power. Yet, even as the Christian church rose in prominence, there remained a cultural tension. The old pagan traditions did not vanish overnight. Temples dedicated to the gods of Rome still stood, though they were increasingly relegated to the shadows of the new Christian order. Philosophers continued to teach, though now their classical ideas were increasingly viewed through the lens of Christian doctrine. This fusion of the old and new, Roman paganism and Christianity, was embodied in the very structure of Constantinople, where monumental pagan symbols were repurposed to serve the needs of a new Christian vision. The pagan past was not erased. It was incorporated into the fabric of a city that represented both the end of one era and the beginning of another. The influx of goods into the city, silk from China, spices from India, gold from Africa, and grain from Egypt, helped to fuel the economy and expand the empire's wealth. But it was the city's intellectual life that would have a lasting impact on both the Byzantine Empire and the world. Scholars, many of whom were connected to the church, gathered in Constantinople's libraries, absorbing ancient texts and classical philosophies. These scholars did not simply preserve the classical world, they adapted it, blending Roman law and Greek philosophy with the emerging Christian theology. As Constantinople grew, so did its power and influence. It was no longer just an imperial city. It had become the intellectual and spiritual heart of the Christian world, a place where ideas from across the empire merged into something new. The city's cultural identity was shaped by this melange of influences, creating a rich and complex tapestry that would define the Byzantine Empire for centuries to come. The role of Christian bishops in shaping the city's culture and spiritual life cannot be overstated. They not only advised the emperor on religious matters, but also wielded considerable power in the imperial court. Their influence in shaping art, architecture, and public life made them the driving force behind the city's spiritual and cultural renaissance. By the time the Hagia Sophia rose to dominate the skyline, Constantinople was no longer just a city. It was the epitome of a new world order, a place where faith and imperial power coexisted in a way unseen in the classical world. The city had become a beacon of Christianity, a place where the old and new were not in opposition, but had been woven together into something greater than either alone. Constantinople, a city of diverse peoples, faiths, and cultures, would go on to influence the course of world history for more than a millennium. Its rise, fueled by trade, faith, and vision, was not just the story of an emperor's dream fulfilled, but the story of a city that would forever change the world. In the aftermath of the monumental decision to establish Constantinople as the new capital of the Roman Empire, Constantine's legacy began to take shape. An intricate tapestry of faith, power, and political transformation that would define the future of both the Byzantine Empire and Christianity for centuries to come. For Constantine, the foundation of Constantinople was not merely the construction of a city, it was a divine mission, a way to bind the Christian faith with the imperial power that had long been the hallmark of Roman rule. But in the unfolding of this mission, Constantine's journey would reveal much more than just the rise of an empire. It would be the birth of a new world order. Constantine's first major achievement was his political consolidation of the empire. After years of civil war, Constantine became the sole emperor in 324 CE, uniting the empire under one banner. But unity, for him, was not just a matter of military strength or political strategy. It was about religious vision. The Christian faith had been growing across the empire for over 2 centuries, and Constantine's conversion was nothing short of a historical pivot. His personal faith journey, marked by the vision he had before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, led him to embrace Christianity not only as a religion, but as the new spiritual backbone of the empire. But Constantine's decision wasn't without its tensions. The Roman Empire was built on centuries of pagan tradition, and the transition to a Christian empire posed challenges far beyond the construction of buildings. Constantine had to navigate between old pagan rituals and new Christian practices, between the vestiges of Rome's ancient gods and the growing influence of Christian bishops. This tension would define not only his rule, but also the legacy he left behind. The city of Constantinople, which he founded in 330 CE, became the crucible in which this religious and political transformation would take place. Constantinople, as the new seat of imperial power, was the physical manifestation of Constantine's vision of a Christian empire. In it, the old pagan symbols of Rome, its gods, its temples, and its military triumphs were repurposed, reimagined through the lens of Christianity. The great palaces, churches, and basilicas were constructed not merely as seats of power, but as sacred spaces, where the emperor's divine authority and the church's religious authority would become inseparable. At the heart of this transformation was the Hagia Sophia, a church that would be constructed later by Justinian IV, but whose foundation and significance were laid by Constantine's decisions. Its massive dome, still an architectural marvel today, would become the symbol of Christian unity, a symbol of the bond between the emperor's temporal power and the church's divine mission. In every stone of Constantinople's walls, in every column of its forums, one could see the imprint of Constantine's desire to marry the empire's power with the Christian faith. But the most profound aspect of Constantine's legacy lay in his institutionalization of Christianity. In 313 CE, the Edict of Milan granted religious tolerance throughout the empire, effectively ending centuries of Christian persecution. This was not merely a shift in religious policy, it was the beginning of Christianity's ascension to the center of imperial life. Constantine didn't just stop at granting freedom of worship. He actively sought to promote Christianity within the imperial structure. Churches were built on imperial funds. Christian clergy became imperial advisors, and Christianity began to influence the empire's political structures. The emperor himself became not just a political ruler, but a defender of the faith. He called the First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, setting the foundation for Christian orthodoxy and establishing his own role as the protector of Christian doctrine. This transition from paganism to Christianity was not without its challenges. In Rome, the pagan temples stood tall, and the ancient gods still held sway over the populace. Constantine, however, was undeterred. His personal faith and divine mission drove him to push forward, constructing Christian buildings, funding the clergy, and ensuring that the imperial court was aligned with Christian values. Constantinople, with its fusion of Christian doctrine and Roman architecture, became a symbol of the new order, a city where church and state were one. The impact of Constantine's establishment of Constantinople as the center of Christian power reverberated far beyond his death. Though the Western Roman Empire would collapse in 476 CE, the Byzantine Empire, with Constantinople at its heart, would endure for another 1,000 years. The The city became the spiritual capital of Eastern Christianity, and its role as a center of intellectual thought, theology, and imperial governance was unparalleled. Under Justinian I, the Byzantine Empire would reach its peak, and Constantinople would serve as the center of a Christian civilization that stretched from the Balkans to the Holy Land. The Great Schism of 1054, which divided Christianity into Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, would center on Constantinople's claim as the rightful leader of the Christian world. Even as the empire weakened, Constantinople's role as the heart of Christian power remained unchallenged. Constantine's personal impact on both the political future of the empire and the church's influence cannot be overstated. His establishment of a Christian empire marked a new chapter in both world history and Christian history. Constantinople was not merely a city, it was a symbol of divine providence, a place where Christianity and imperial power coexisted in a way that would influence the future of both the church and the state for centuries to come. In every sense, Constantine's legacy is felt not just in the ruins of Constantinople, but in the lasting impact of his decisions, his promotion of Christianity, his vision for a Christian empire, and his establishment of a city that would forever be the center of Christian power. As Constantinople stood, proud and shimmering at the crossroads of East and West, the empire's future was anything but secure. Constantine's grand vision had ensured that the city was a beacon of Christian power and imperial strength. But as the 5th century wore on, that sense of invincibility began to fray. The Byzantine Empire, still emerging from the ashes of the Roman Empire, faced a growing tide of barbarian invasions, internal strife, and the looming threat of a shifting world order. With each passing year, the unassailable walls of Constantinople seemed more like a relic of the past than the invincible fortress they were meant to be. Something needed to change, something dramatic, something unthinkable for a city that had long been thought to be untouchable. In this moment of uncertainty, Theodosius II, the young and often overlooked emperor of the Byzantine Empire, made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of Constantinople. Faced with the constant threat of invasion and the growing weakness of the Roman world, Theodosius ordered the construction of a new defense system, the Theodosian Walls. These walls, rising up around the city, would be more than just a physical barrier against invaders. They would be the very embodiment of the empire's determination to survive, to stand firm against the chaos threatening from all sides. But Theodosius' decision was not born from simple pragmatism. It was a response to a world that seemed increasingly beyond the empire's control. The Roman Empire, once a vast and imposing power, was no longer the force it had been. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, a few decades later, would prove this beyond doubt. The shift from a unified empire to a fractured one left Constantinople, the new Eastern capital, vulnerable. The barbarian invasions, the rise of the Huns, and the constant threat of attacks from the Persian Empire and beyond made the city's walls, which had long been seen as impenetrable, increasingly obsolete. What Theodosius needed was something more, a defense system that would not only defend against external threats, but also reaffirm the Byzantine Empire's resilience. And so, in 408 CE, the emperor took a monumental step. He ordered the construction of Theodosian Walls. This was no ordinary fortification. It was a massive engineering feat, designed to defend Constantinople against the increasingly sophisticated barbarian armies and provide a symbol of the empire's enduring strength. The walls themselves were nothing short of unprecedented. 3 layers of defense would form the backbone of the structure, creating a layered defense system that allowed for multiple lines of resistance. The outer wall was thick and fortified, built to withstand direct assaults. Behind it, the second wall was even more formidable, with towers built into the structure to allow for counterattacks and surveillance. The inner wall was the final bastion, the last line of defense for the imperial heart of Constantinople. The city's defenders could now hold off an attacking force for days, if not weeks, while reinforcements arrived or the threat was contained. One of the most innovative features of the Theodosian Walls was the 60-foot wide moat that encircled the city. The moat, which was not just a simple trench, but a deep, wide expanse, served as an additional obstacle for invaders attempting to reach the walls. Imagine a would-be attacker standing at the edge of the moat, peering across at the towering walls of Constantinople, knowing that every attempt to cross would be met with arrows, fire, and the unrelenting assault of the defenders above. But the defensive prowess of the Theodosian Walls went beyond just their sheer size and scope. These walls were designed to endure, not only against human threats, but against the ravages of time itself. The walls were built with the best materials, using a mixture of brick and limestone that would withstand both earthquakes and siege engines. These were not just walls, they were symbols of the empire's resolve, built with imperial ambition and divine purpose. As the Theodosian Walls rose, the city's citizens felt a renewed sense of security. For centuries, the walls of Constantinople had been symbols of protection, but now, with the Theodosian Walls in place, the sense of unassailable power was palpable. The city was fortified beyond measure, and its defenders were ready. The Goths, the Huns, and all those who sought to breach the walls of the city would find themselves up against not just stone, but the very will of the Byzantine Empire. These walls were a statement. Constantinople was not going to fall. But the true genius of the Theodosian Walls lay in their ability to survive not just battles, but the very forces of nature. Time and again, earthquakes, which often devastated other cities, failed to break the strength of the walls. The materials used in their construction and the sheer design ensured that they withstood the ravages of time, offering protection long after Theodosius II's reign had ended. The Theodosian Walls became more than just a military necessity. They became a symbol of survival, of the Byzantine spirit that would carry the city through the most difficult centuries of its existence. They stood as a reminder that no matter the threats from beyond the empire's borders, Constantinople would endure. The walls weren't just a defense against armies, they were a testament to the empire's imperial will, to the faith that Constantinople was the center of a world destined to last. Even as the Ottoman Turks breached those walls in 1453, bringing about the fall of Constantinople, the legacy of the Theodosian Walls endured. They had fulfilled their purpose, standing as the ultimate defense for the city for over a millennium. Today, remnants of those ancient walls still stand, echoing the resilience of a city that refused to bow to time, invaders, or even the elements. It was a time of unimaginable tension, when the mighty city of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, stood at the precipice of its first true test of strength. The horizon darkened in the spring of 447 CE, as the earth trembled beneath the relentless march of one of the most feared men to ever walk the earth, Attila the Hun. Known as the Scourge of God, Attila's name alone struck terror into the hearts of empires. He had carved a trail of destruction across the Eastern Roman Empire, burning cities to the ground, and now his sights were set on the greatest prize of all, Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine world. But why, after conquering so many great cities, would Attila suddenly turn his gaze toward Constantinople, only to retreat in the end? What force could turn the conqueror of nations away from the city that was the key to the empire's survival? The answer lay in a combination of military calculation, divine intervention, and a resilience in the people of Constantinople that would defy even the most powerful invader. Attila's advance had been swift and brutal, his forces ravaging the Balkans as they surged toward Constantinople. He had already laid waste to cities like Nicomedia and Thessalonica, leaving nothing but ruins and despair in his wake. His army, unmatched in its speed and ferocity, seemed unstoppable. The Huns were a fearsome force, skilled horsemen, expert archers, and warriors with a reputation for unrelenting conquest. But Constantinople was different. The city on the Bosphorus had stood for centuries as a symbol of strength and spiritual power, with the Theodosian Walls rising high, encircled by the 60-foot wide moat. Constantinople's defenses were legendary. They had withstood earthquakes and savage attacks in the past, but this was different. Attila, with his massive army, had been told that the city's walls were impregnable, and indeed, they were a force to be reckoned with. Yet the walls were not the only defense the city had. Within those walls lay the heart of the Byzantine Empire, a people united by faith and determination. As Attila's army neared Constantinople, there was an air of uncertainty inside the city. The earthquake that had struck months earlier had damaged some sections of the walls, leaving parts of the fortifications vulnerable. The city's defenders, weary from years of constant tension, worked tirelessly to repair the damage. They were determined to hold on, knowing that if Constantinople fell, the heart of the empire would be shattered. But the most important defense, perhaps, was the morale of the people. The citizens of Constantinople, despite the cracks in their defenses, were united in a way few others in the empire had ever been. The city was not just a military stronghold, it was the center of Christianity. The Byzantine Empire, now firmly rooted in Christian doctrine, viewed the city's defense as a sacred duty. The bishops and clergy, alongside the emperor's soldiers, rallied the people, calling on the divine protection of the city. Then, on the eve of the siege, something remarkable happened. Attila, who had been undefeated in battle, looked upon the walls of Constantinople, immense, towering, and reinforced by the hard work of the people, and saw something he had not anticipated: a resilience, a spiritual strength that could not be measured by sheer force. The defenders, although still recovering from the damage of the earthquake, stood firm, fortified by their faith, their resolve, and the belief that Constantinople's walls were more than just stone. They were the shield of God's will. Attila's retreat, though shrouded in mystery, has been attributed to a combination of factors. There were rumors of divine intervention. Some believed that the Virgin Mary had protected the city, sending a sign to Attila that he would not be allowed to conquer the city. Others point to his weary troops, stretched thin after months of continuous warfare, unable to sustain a prolonged siege against the impenetrable walls of Constantinople. In the end, Attila, the scourge of nations, the conqueror of cities, retreated. His once unstoppable advance halted at the gates of Constantinople. This was no defeat for Attila alone. It was a triumph for the Byzantine people, a test of faith that proved their resilience and their ability to hold their ground against the greatest of threats. The retreat of Attila became a defining moment in the history of Constantinople. It would be celebrated as an example of the city's invincibility and divine favor. The Theodosian Walls, once mere symbols of military might, were now symbols of divine protection, proving that no force, be it human or supernatural, could break the will of Constantinople's defenders. Attila's decision to turn away from the gates of Constantinople marked a key turning point in the Byzantine Empire's story. It reinforced the myth of Constantinople's invincibility and solidified the city's status as the beacon of Christianity. For the people inside, it was a moment of triumph, one that would fuel their determination and inspire their resistance against all future invaders. Constantinople stood strong, defying the odds when it seemed impossible. But how many of us face our own walls, only to give up when things get tough? Don't let your own struggles go unchallenged. If you found strength in this story, show your support. Like, comment, and subscribe. Your future self will thank you. The ancient Byzantine Empire, born from the ashes of the Roman Empire, was a world of splendor and strife, where the magnificent walls of Constantinople loomed as silent witnesses to centuries of glory, conflict, and transformation. In the early 6th century, the empire's future seemed uncertain, its past a tapestry of both triumph and decay. At a time when the Eastern Roman Empire was struggling to maintain its hold on what remained of the Roman legacy, a new figure emerged from the shadows of history, one whose vision, ambition, and indomitable will would change the course of the empire forever. This was Justinian Walls, a man not born into the power that would eventually be his, but forged in the fire of ambition, shrewd political calculation, and a desire to restore the Roman world. His story was not just one of a ruler rising to power, but a journey of self-made greatness. Born in 483 CE in the province of Moesia, Justinian was the nephew of Emperor Justin III, a former soldier who had risen from the ranks to the throne. From the moment Justinian set foot in the imperial court, he was driven by one idea: to reclaim the lost glory of Rome, to rebuild what had crumbled. His early years were spent learning the intricacies of imperial governance, military strategy, and diplomacy. Though Constantinople was already a powerful center of the Eastern Roman Empire, Justinian understood that power was not just political, it was about reclaiming territories, reforming laws, and solidifying Christian rule. This became his central ambition: to reunite the fractured empire that had once spanned from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. But it was not only the expansion of power that defined Justinian's early reign. It was his marriage to Theodora, a woman whose influence would alter the course of history. Theodora, once an actress with humble beginnings, was more than just a wife. She was a co-ruler. In their marriage, Justinian found not only love, but an intellectual and political partner who would support and shape his most ambitious reforms. Theodora's influence over Justinian's policies on women's rights, religious matters, and social justice became a defining feature of his rule. Together, they stood as a unified force, a partnership that would defy convention and challenge the traditional boundaries of power dynamics. But while their relationship was rooted in mutual respect, it was also tested by political strife and military pressure. Justinian, though a man of vision, understood that the Byzantine Empire, his empire, could only survive if it was strong militarily, spiritually, and economically. Justinian's vision to restore the Roman Empire began with a series of ambitious military campaigns. The first major battle was to reclaim North Africa, a vital region that had been lost to the Vandals in the 5th century. Belisarius, the brilliant general who would become Justinian's most trusted military commander, was sent to North Africa in 533 CE. Under Belisarius's leadership, the Vandal kingdom was swiftly crushed and the city of Carthage was recaptured. This was more than just a military victory. It was a statement that Justinian's empire could regain its former glory. But Justinian's eyes were not only fixed on the southern territories. He had one eye on the west, on Italy, and the Ostrogothic kingdom, which had taken control of the Italian peninsula after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Justinian saw the Italian territories as essential to his larger vision of a unified Roman Empire. In 535 CE, he launched a brutal campaign to reclaim Italy. The Gothic War would become one of the longest and most costly conflicts of Justinian's reign, lasting from 535 CE to 554 CE. The war was not easy. The Ostrogoths, led by King Witiges, proved a fierce adversary. Yet, Justinian's forces, under the command of Belisarius and later Narses, were relentless. Slowly, through siege warfare, brutal battles, and political maneuvering, Rome and the rest of Italy were brought back under Byzantine control. While the reconquest was celebrated as a monumental achievement, it also came at a great cost: economic strain, military exhaustion, and the loss of life that would weaken the empire in the long run. These campaigns were only the beginning of Justinian's grand vision. His desire to restore the Western Roman Empire through conquest was paired with his efforts to reform the empire's legal structure. In 529 CE, Justinian commissioned the creation of the Corpus Juris Civilis, a massive codification of Roman law that would become the foundation of modern civil law. The Code of Justinian not only reformed the legal system, but also sought to strengthen the imperial authority in the religious and political spheres. Justinian's reign, however, was not just about reclamation and reform. It was about legacy. His desire to secure his place in history as a ruler who had reunited Rome, reformed its legal system, and shaped its Christian future. His successes, both military and political, would shape the Byzantine Empire for centuries to come, ensuring that the Roman legacy would live on in the Christian East. In the years to come, Justinian would face immense challenges, both within his empire and from without. But his early success in reclaiming the Western territories and implementing sweeping reforms set the stage for the empire's golden age. His partnership with Theodora, his military achievements, and his relentless ambition would be remembered as the foundation of a Byzantine Empire that would endure for over 1,000 years. The year was 532 CE, and the streets of Constantinople were alive with tension. The great city, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, had long stood as a beacon of imperial strength and Christian faith, but beneath its grandeur, unrest was brewing. The Nika riots, as they would come to be known, were not just another series of protests. They were a cataclysmic upheaval that threatened to tear the very fabric of the empire apart. The Blues and the Greens, two rival factions who had dominated chariot racing in the Hippodrome, had united, their shared grievances against Justinian first boiling over into violent rebellion. As the mob surged through the streets, setting fire to buildings and looting the treasures of Constantinople, it became clear that Justinian's reign was at risk. The emperor, once a ruler with seemingly unshakable power, now stood at the edge of disaster. His closest advisors urged him to flee, but Justinian, resolute and unyielding, made a choice that would define his legacy. He would not run. Instead, he chose to face the rebellion head-on, standing firm in the face of civil unrest. The riots were brutal, and Constantinople, the jewel of the empire, was on the brink of collapse. Thousands were killed. The city was left in flames, and Hagia Sophia, the very church that had been a symbol of the empire's spiritual strength, lay in ruins. Justinian saw the destruction as both a catastrophe and an opportunity to reshape the empire, both politically and symbolically. The decision to rebuild Hagia Sophia was more than just a matter of restoration. It was a bold statement. a declaration that despite the chaos, the Byzantine Empire would rise again, stronger and more unified than before. Justinian understood that the new Hagia Sophia could serve as a symbol of his imperial power and the Christian faith that defined his reign. What had been destroyed in the fire of rebellion would be reborn as a monument to divine order and imperial triumph. The task of rebuilding Hagia Sophia was entrusted to the brilliant architects, Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles. They were tasked with the impossible, creating a structure that would not only stand as the grandest church ever built, but would also symbolize the union of heaven and earth. The design they conceived was revolutionary, the most striking feature being the massive dome that would rise above the structure. This dome, unlike anything seen before, would become the centerpiece of the church, floating above the space, supported by pendentives, a technique that would allow the dome to appear as though it was suspended by divine will rather than earthly support. The dome was not just an architectural wonder, it was a symbol of Justinian's grand vision for the empire. It represented the unity of the heavens, a divine mandate that Justinian believed gave him the authority to rule both the earthly and theological realms. When the light poured through the windows of Hagia Sophia, illuminating the golden mosaics and the gleaming marble floors, it was a visual representation of God's favor upon the emperor. The Byzantine Empire, Justinian believed, was the new Rome, the center of Christian civilization, and Hagia Sophia would stand as its eternal heart. But the rebuilding of Hagia Sophia was not just about architecture, it was a political strategy. Justinian understood that the Nika riots had nearly destroyed his reign. To restore his credibility and ensure the loyalty of his subjects, he needed to create a monument to his strength, his resilience, and his divine purpose. The new Hagia Sophia would not just be a church, it would be the ultimate assertion of power. By rebuilding it, Justinian could demonstrate that he had the vision and the willpower to rebuild both the spiritual and political foundations of the empire. The construction of Hagia Sophia was an undertaking of unprecedented scale. Workers, architects, and artists from all over the empire were brought together to create the grand structure. For years, the people of Constantinople watched as the great church took shape, its walls rising higher and higher, its dome growing more and more magnificent. Every stone laid, every tile set in place was a testament to the empire's resilience and Justinian's determination to leave a lasting legacy. When Hagia Sophia was finally completed and consecrated in 537 CE, it was hailed as a masterpiece of Byzantine architecture, and for Justinian, it was the crowning achievement of his reign. The church, with its soaring dome, marble columns, and golden mosaics, became the physical embodiment of the Byzantine Empire's spiritual authority. The light that streamed through the dome was not just a symbol of divine favor, but of Justinian's triumph over the chaos that had once threatened his rule. The Nika riots, in the end, had not only tested Justinian's leadership, but had also provided him with the opportunity to redefine his empire's identity. The rebuilding of Hagia Sophia was his way of demonstrating that no force, whether internal rebellion or external threat, could undermine the Byzantine Empire's divine mandate. Through his leadership, his vision, and his unwavering resolve, Justinian transformed a moment of crisis into an era of reconstruction and unity. Today, Hagia Sophia still stands as a living testament to the vision of Justinian, the emperor who refused to be defeated by either the wrath of the people or the challenges of rebuilding an empire. It remains one of the most iconic and revered structures in the world, embodying both the spiritual and imperial aspirations of the Byzantine Empire. In the cradle of the Byzantine Empire, amidst the hustle and grandeur of Constantinople, A new chapter of imperial vision was about to unfold. The Nika riots had barely faded from the streets of the city when Emperor Justinian I, still determined to prove his strength and vision for the empire, would embark on an endeavor that would forever change not just the Byzantine Empire, but the legal foundation of the Western world. This was the codification of law, a project so ambitious that it would eventually become known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the Code of Justinian, a monumental work of legal scholarship that would become the bedrock of modern civil law. Justinian was a man whose reign was characterized by grand ambitions and enduring legacy. But behind every piece of his imperial policy, whether military, architectural, or religious, was a deeply personal vision to restore the Roman Empire, not just in territory, but in law. The empire had suffered for centuries from a fractured legal system, where laws were scattered, inconsistent, and often impractical for a world that had rapidly outgrown the old Roman traditions. For Justinian, the answer to these problems was clear: a unified, codified system of law which would not only reignite the Roman legacy, but solidify the Byzantine Empire as the spiritual center of a unified Christian world. But what drove Justinian to this extraordinary decision? The emperor's early exposure to the chaos of Roman law was likely a defining factor. The laws that had once guided the mighty Roman Empire were now outdated, fragmented, and contradictory. As an emperor with an imperial mindset, Justinian understood that to lead an empire as vast as Byzantium, where cultures, customs, and laws varied wildly, a unified and comprehensive legal framework was essential. Without such a system, the empire's unity and authority could crumble under the weight of disorder and discontent. Thus, in 529 CE, Justinian began his legal overhaul, a reform so sweeping, so profound, that it would lay the foundation for Western law for centuries. He assembled a team of legal experts, the finest minds in the empire, to take on the task of reorganizing, clarifying, and codifying centuries of Roman law. The chief architect of this ambitious project was Tribonian, a brilliant legal scholar who led the commission to sift through thousands of pages of legal text, from imperial decrees to the writings of Roman jurists, to create a cohesive legal code that could serve as a living document for the empire's future. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Code of Justinian, which consisted of four major parts. 1. The Codex Justinianus, a collection of the imperial decrees issued by past emperors, including those of Justinian himself. 2. The Digest, a compendium of legal writings, offering commentary from some of the greatest legal minds of Roman history. 3. The Institutes, a legal textbook designed for students of law and practitioners, providing an introduction to the principles of Roman law. 4. The Novels, new laws that Justinian introduced after the initial publication of the code, covering contemporary issues within the empire. Justinian's goal was not just to preserve the Roman legal tradition. He sought to streamline it, modernize it, and make it more applicable to the growing Byzantine society. His codification offered clarity and consistency, allowing judges, officials, and citizens to understand the laws governing their lives. The Code of Justinian also provided stability, helping to regulate trade, property rights, marriage, and inheritance across the empire. In doing so, Justinian didn't merely establish a legal framework. He consolidated the power of the emperor by aligning imperial authority with the law. As a political tool, the Code of Justinian reinforced the divine right of the emperor. Just like the emperor's authority was believed to come from God, so too was the law, reflecting the emperor's will as divinely ordained. The codification of Christian values also played a role in Justinian's vision of a Christian empire. His legal system promoted the unity of the empire under Christian teachings, which aligned with his policies of religious orthodoxy and imperial consolidation. The impact of the Code of Justinian reached far beyond the walls of Constantinople. As the Byzantine Empire continued to exert influence over the Mediterranean world, the Corpus Juris Civilis became a model for European legal systems. In the 12th century, the code was rediscovered in Italy and later spread to the rest of Europe. By the Middle Ages, civil law, based on the Code of Justinian, had become the backbone of Western legal traditions. Its influence was so profound that it is still felt today in civil law countries such as France, Germany, and Spain. Through this monumental legal achievement, Justinian ensured that his empire's legacy would extend far beyond his military campaigns or the brilliant architecture of Hagia Sophia. The Code of Justinian transformed the legal landscape of the ancient world, laying the groundwork for modern jurisprudence and providing the Byzantine Empire with a legal identity that endured long after his reign. In the face of crises, war, and rebellion, Justinian's legal reforms were a lasting symbol of his imperial vision, a vision that would outlast the Byzantine Empire itself, shaping the future of Western civilization for centuries. His Code of Justinian, both a practical tool and a philosophical manifesto, continues to be studied as one of the most important achievements of antiquity, ensuring that his legacy as a lawgiver stands as tall as the monumental structures he built. As Emperor Justinian has looked out over the city of Constantinople, its gleaming domes, the distant hum of busy marketplaces, the bustling life of the Byzantine Empire's heart, he saw more than just a city. He saw a vision to reunite the fragmented Roman Empire, to revitalize Roman law, to build monuments that would stand as testaments to his power and the greatness of his reign. But even the greatest of emperors can't escape the cruel tides of fate. The Byzantine Empire, under Justinian, reached the peak of its military conquests and cultural achievements, but it was also an empire stretched thin, too ambitious for its own good. The internal and external crises he faced would test the limits of his empire's strength and ultimately shape his legacy in ways that he could never have foreseen. In the year 541 CE, the streets of Constantinople were filled with a strange quiet, as if the air itself had been drained of its usual energy. The plague of Justinian, a silent killer that spread from the ports of the Black Sea, arrived like a shadow, sudden, terrifying, and devastating. For Justinian, this would become the most personal crisis of his reign. It wasn't just the death toll, which would wipe out nearly half the population of Constantinople, that shook him to his core. It was the paralysis of his empire, the death of so many of his subjects, and the economic collapse that followed. The plague crept through the city like a mournful fog. People fell ill with the bubonic plague, their bodies turning dark, swollen with a deadly infection. The disease spread with terrifying speed, slipping from household to household, from one district of the city to the next. In Constantinople, the heart of the empire, it left streets eerily empty, once vibrant marketplaces silent, and entire families gone in a matter of days. Public life came to a halt. Economic activities that had powered the city ground to a halt. The economic impact was overwhelming. The trade routes were severely disrupted. The army, so vital to Justinian's military aspirations, was decimated, leaving the empire vulnerable at a time when it needed to hold firm. For Justinian, the realization set in. His grand vision for the empire was slipping away, undone not by an enemy army, but by a microscopic foe. The plague of Justinian left its scars, not just on the flesh of the people, but on the empire's very foundation. As the emperor surveyed the damage, he could no longer ignore the fragility of his grand vision. Even as he saw the rebuilding of the empire in North Africa and Italy, he felt the weight of the plague's toll pulling him back from his ambitious campaigns. The military, which had been a source of pride, was now a shadow of its former self. The city walls, though strong, now felt more like a symbol of vulnerability than impenetrable strength. But Justinian, ever the determined emperor, refused to let his dreams slip away. He continued his campaigns to reclaim the lost western territories of the Roman Empire, a task that would prove to be both his greatest triumph and his most significant failure. His conquest of North Africa began in 533 CE, when his general Belisarius achieved a decisive victory over the Vandals. The reclamation of Carthage was celebrated as a triumph, a beacon of hope that Justinian could restore the glory of Rome. Yet the costs of these campaigns were not immediately felt. The lands were recovered, but maintaining control was a different challenge entirely. The Gothic War in Italy, which lasted from 535 CE to 554 CE, would become a bitter reminder of the difficulty of holding the conquered lands. Despite Belisarius's initial successes in Italy, including the recovery of Rome and Ravenna, the empire struggled to hold the Italian peninsula. The Ostrogoths, fierce and determined, continued to fight back. The war, long and draining, exhausted Byzantine resources, money, manpower, and morale. Italy, though regained, became a land that was hard to hold and harder still to govern. Justinian's military overreach was evident as his empire, exhausted by wars on multiple fronts, found itself stretched thin. The territories in the west were too far removed from the empire's core in Constantinople, and the military supply lines were insufficient. What began as a reclamation of lost glory turned into a struggle to hold on to those conquests. The military campaigns, combined with the effects of the plague, left the empire vulnerable to further attacks and internal strife. As the decades passed, the western territories began to slip from Justinian's grasp. The long-term sustainability of his conquests was always in doubt. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Lombards, and other groups would eventually push back, and the Vandals in North Africa were unable to maintain their positions. The empire's weakening military, further compounded by the economic crisis following the plague, made it increasingly difficult to hold these newly conquered lands. Despite these setbacks, Justinian's legacy remains one of greatness. The codification of law, the magnificent Hagia Sophia, and his vision of a unified empire cannot be overshadowed by the challenges he faced. However, his inability to retain the territories he worked so hard to reclaim, and the long-term consequences of the plague, showed the fragility of empire, the complex balance between ambition and sustainability. The story of Justinian's reign is one of triumphs and setbacks, of vision and realpolitik, of a man who sought to restore an empire to glory, but whose ambition was ultimately tested by forces beyond his control. Yet, even as his empire shrank, his legacy of law, architecture, and Christian governance continue to echo through history, shaping the future of both the Byzantine Empire and the West. If you're still here, thank you for sticking with me. Click on the subscribe button so we can keep diving into history together. There's so much more to uncover, and I'd love for you to be part of this journey. As Justinian, I sat on his throne in Constantinople, surveying his empire. He could not have foreseen the cataclysmic forces that were about to unfold at the gates of his empire. The Byzantine Empire, once the proud heir to the Roman Empire, was facing its greatest crisis since the days of the barbarian invasions. By the mid-7th century, a new force was rising in the east: Islam. and it would sweep across the Mediterranean world, shattering the Byzantine world order in ways that Justinian could never have predicted. The early years of Islam were marked by rapid military expansion, led by the Rashidun caliphs who sought to unite the Arabian Peninsula under the banner of a single faith and empire. The Prophet Muhammad's teachings had already spread across the Arabian desert, but it was after his death in 632 CE that Islam's true military power began to emerge. As the Caliphate's forces marched westward, the Byzantine Empire, which had long considered itself the defender of Christendom, found itself facing a new adversary, the Muslim armies. By 636 CE, the first great clash occurred at the Battle of Yarmouk, a battle that would go down in history as one of the most decisive defeats the Byzantines had ever suffered. The Byzantine army, once the envy of the ancient world, was decimated by the Muslim forces under the command of Khalid ibn al-Walid, known as the Sword of Allah. The battle took place near the Yarmouk River in modern-day Syria, a region that had been a strategic and economic linchpin for the Byzantine Empire. The loss of Syria was catastrophic. Damascus, once a jewel of the Byzantine East, fell, and with it, the entire region of Syria was lost. The heart of the Byzantine Empire in the East was no longer just under threat. It had been wrenched away by a new and determined force. With Syria lost, the Islamic armies turned their attention to Egypt, a region that had been the lifeblood of the Byzantine Empire. Egypt supplied the empire's grain, and the grain from the Nile was essential for feeding the people of Constantinople. When the Muslims arrived in 641 CE, the Byzantine Empire was in no position to mount a defensive response. Alexandria, the second largest city in the empire and a major center of trade, culture, and Christian scholarship, fell to the Muslims. The loss of Egypt was more than a military defeat. It was a devastating blow to the empire's economy, and it would forever change the course of the empire's history. The fall of Egypt was followed by the loss of North Africa, including the city of Carthage, which had been the Byzantine capital of the region. The Vandal kingdom, which had once been a thorn in the side of the Byzantine Empire, was wiped out by Islamic forces, and the Byzantines could no longer claim their former dominion over North Africa. The Mediterranean had been the heart of Byzantine power, but now it was no longer an internal sea. It was the fiefdom of a growing Islamic empire. The Byzantine Empire found itself reeling from this series of blows, its eastern and southern borders decimated, its trade routes severed, and its economic resources strained. What had been a mighty empire, stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the Persian Gulf, was now reduced to a shrunken and vulnerable state. Justinian's dream of restoring the Roman Empire had now faced its most profound challenge, one that was about to redefine the Byzantine world forever. The loss of these territories had a profound cultural and economic impact on Byzantine society. The empire's focus, once centered on maintaining its vast Mediterranean holdings, now shifted eastward. The Byzantine elite, no longer able to depend on the wealth of Egypt and North Africa, found themselves retreating to the eastern frontier, where they would now face an expanding Muslim caliphate in the east and the ever-present threat of Persia. Constantinople, the capital, became a fortress in a shrinking empire. The Byzantines could no longer afford to maintain their imperial reach in the west. The reconquest of the Roman world was not just a failure, it had become a foolish dream. In response to this existential crisis, the Byzantine Empire began to shift its focus inward and eastward. Assyria, Egypt, and North Africa fell. The Byzantines were forced to defend their core lands. The eastern frontier, long a source of tension with the Persians, became the empire's primary concern. Justinian, though gone, had left a legacy of fortifications and military preparedness, but the empire could no longer sustain its expansionist dreams. Its attention turned inward, and the great naval fleets and armies that had once stretched across the Mediterranean now found themselves focused on defending Constantinople and preserving the heart of the empire. In the bustling streets of Constantinople, under the watchful eyes of the Byzantine Empire's rulers, a deep and ideological battle was taking shape, one that would divide the church, stir violent protests, and alter the very fabric of Byzantine society. It began as a religious debate, but quickly spiraled into a political confrontation that would send shockwaves through the empire. This was the beginning of the iconoclastic controversy. It was the 8th century, and the Byzantine Empire, still recovering from the onslaught of Islamic conquests, was struggling to assert its religious and imperial authority in the midst of new challenges. As Emperor Leo III stood at the helm, a man whose military prowess had won him victory over the Arabs, he now found himself at odds with a very different kind of battle, a battle of theology. Leo, a devout Christian emperor, believed that the worship of religious icons, the images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, was a threat to the spiritual purity of the empire. To Leo and his supporters, the use of icons violated the Second Commandment's prohibition of idolatry, and they believed that their veneration led to an unacceptable form of worshipping images instead of the divine. In 726 CE, Leo III issued an imperial decree that outlawed the veneration of icons. This was no mere theological suggestion. It was a direct attack on the most fundamental religious practice in the Byzantine Empire. Churches and monasteries were ordered to remove their icons, and in many cases, icons were burned, destroyed, or defaced. The emperor's authority, already strong in political matters, now extended to spiritual matters, and this decision sent tremors through the Byzantine world. For the iconoclasts, the emperor's decision was a righteous act to purge the church of what they saw as false worship. For the iconophiles, it was an attack on the heart of their faith, a denial of the sacred images that had long been part of the Christian identity. The iconophiles, led by powerful clergy and monks, argued that icons were not objects of worship themselves, but tools that helped the faithful connect with the divine. Icons, they believed, brought the holy figures closer to the people, offering a visual bridge between the earthly and the divine. The political decision to outlaw icons became a religious flashpoint, and the empire was soon embroiled in riots, civil unrest, and religious strife. The streets of Constantinople were filled with passionate crowds who clashed with soldiers loyal to the emperor. In monasteries and churches, clergy and noble families protested vehemently, refusing to give up their icons. The empire was not just divided theologically, it was splintered along class lines, with the common people defending their icons and the aristocracy caught in the struggle between imperial authority and religious devotion. The controversy was not limited to the Byzantine Empire. The Pope in Rome and the Latin Church had long viewed the Byzantine Emperor's role as a figure who ruled over the Christian Empire, but not over the Church itself. When the Pope sided with the iconophiles, supporting the veneration of icons, it created an ideological rift between the East and West. The papacy saw the Byzantine Empire's iconoclastic policy as an attack on its own authority, and this led to further estrangement between the Eastern and Western branches of Christianity. As the iconoclastic controversy continued to escalate, the Byzantine Empire found itself increasingly divided. The iconoclastic movement was rooted in the emperor's desire to consolidate imperial control over the church and its sacred practices. But in doing so, Leo III and his successors had alienated a substantial portion of the Byzantine clergy and monastic communities. In many ways, the iconoclastic controversy was as much about imperial authority as it was about religious doctrine. It laid the groundwork for a future of separation between the Byzantine Emperor and the Roman papacy, a tension that would culminate in the Great Schism of 1054 CE. Despite the eventual restoration of icons in 843 CE, the iconoclastic controversy had forever changed the landscape of the Byzantine world. The church was fractured and the empire was never the same. The impact of iconoclasm was felt not just in the churches and monasteries, but in the very soul of the empire. The political and religious divisions that the controversy created weakened the Byzantine Empire, distracting it from its more pressing external threats. The division between the Eastern and Western churches also set the stage for future political and theological conflicts that would play out in the centuries that followed. In the eastern expanses of the Byzantine Empire, the echoes of glory and might were beginning to fade. The Byzantine Empire, which had once reigned supreme across the Mediterranean, was now fighting a battle on multiple fronts. Politically, militarily, and economically. It was the 11th century, and the once proud empire was faced with a new and terrifying challenge. A new wave of invaders from the east, the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks, originally a nomadic tribe from the Central Asian steppes, had already begun their westward migration as early as the 10th century. Their leader, Alp-Arslan, had forged a powerful military state that threatened to swallow up the regions that the Byzantine Empire had once controlled. But it wasn't just the rising power of the Seljuks that posed a challenge to the Byzantine Empire. It was the internal division and decay that had weakened the empire from within. The year was 1071, and the Seljuk Turks had reached the heart of Asia Minor, an essential region for the Byzantine Empire's economy and military strength. The Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, determined to stop the Seljuk advance, assembled a massive army to confront the invaders. However, despite a force of nearly 40,000 men, the Byzantine military found itself outmaneuvered and outflanked by the more mobile and agile Seljuk forces under the command of Alp-Arslan. The Battle of Manzikert unfolded on the sweeping plains of central Anatolia, where the Byzantines found themselves caught in a deadly pincer movement. The Seljuk cavalry, famed for its speed and tactical brilliance, devastated the Byzantine lines, and within hours, the Byzantine army was routed. Emperor Romanos IV was captured, and what had once been a fabled military force lay in tatters. The loss at Manzikert didn't just signal a military defeat, it was a turning point for the Byzantine Empire. Asia Minor, once the empire's economic heartland, was now in the hands of the Seljuk Turks. The battle marked the beginning of a slow and painful decline for Byzantine control in the region. The consequences of the defeat at Manzikert were immediate and far-reaching. The loss of Asia Minor meant that the Byzantines could no longer rely on its fertile lands for food production. The grain supply from Egypt, already under threat from the Islamic forces, was no longer sufficient to feed the population of Constantinople. The Seljuk occupation of Anatolia severed vital trade routes, and the Byzantine military was no longer able to patrol the vast frontiers of the empire. Internally, the Byzantine Empire began to unravel. The political division between the Byzantine aristocracy and the imperial court became more pronounced. The emperor's failure to protect Asia Minor led to a loss of confidence in the central authority, and as Romanos IV was captured, the empire was left leaderless, vulnerable to internal factions and external threats. In the wake of Manzikert, the Seljuk Turks began a gradual migration into the region, establishing their foothold in Anatolia. The Seljuks, who had been nomadic for centuries, began to settle in the fertile lands of Asia Minor, replacing the Byzantine elite with their own political and military structure. Over time, these Turkic settlers would become the foundation of the Ottoman Empire, which would eventually grow into one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. For the Byzantine Empire, the rise of the Seljuks in Anatolia meant the beginning of the end. The Turkish influence slowly spread throughout the region, with Seljuk settlements and fortresses dotting the landscape. As the Turkish settlers and Ottoman forces grew stronger, the Byzantines retreated further into Constantinople, forever cut off from the regions that had once given the empire its strength. The consequences of Manzikert were felt most acutely in the Byzantine military. No longer could the empire defend its eastern frontier with the same efficiency as before. The Byzantine army, once a proud force feared across the Mediterranean, was now stretched thin, unable to hold the eastern territories against the advancing Seljuk Turks. The eastern provinces were slowly absorbed into the Seljuk Empire, and as the Ottomans rose to power, the Byzantines were left with little more than their capital, Constantinople, to defend. In the year 1204, the Byzantine Empire, once the proud heir to the Roman Empire, faced a devastating blow that would shake its very foundations. The Fourth Crusade, originally launched with the noble intention of recapturing the Holy Land, was instead diverted toward an unexpected and tragic target: the jewel of the Christian world, Constantinople. What followed was a catastrophic event that not only marked the end of Byzantine power in the Mediterranean, but also marked a profound cultural rift that would echo throughout Christianity for centuries. The Fourth Crusade was initiated by Pope Innocent III in 1198, who called upon Christian knights from across Europe to embark on a new campaign to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims. After the failure of earlier crusades, the Pope hoped this new crusade would unite Christendom and restore Christian dominance in the Holy Land. However, from the very beginning, the crusade was beset by political and financial issues that would alter its path forever. The Venetian merchants, led by Doges Enrico Dandolo, saw the crusade as an opportunity to further their own interests. Venice, a powerful maritime republic, had extensive commercial interests in the Eastern Mediterranean and a growing rivalry with the Byzantine Empire, which controlled much of the region's trade. When the Crusaders arrived in Venice to board ships for the Holy Land, they found themselves in debt to the Venetians for transportation. With funds running low, the Crusaders were offered a deal if they helped Venice conquer the city of Zara, a rebellious Venetian port, and later diverted their efforts to assist the Venetians in a military operation against Constantinople. They would receive the ships they desperately needed. What began as a holy mission to reclaim Jerusalem was now clouded by political intrigue and greed. The Crusaders, desperate for funds and lacking a strong moral compass, agreed to the deal. The promise of plunder and wealth now guided their path, not the call of the Holy Land. In 1203, the Crusaders, alongside the Venetians, turned their attention from Jerusalem to Constantinople, the wealthiest and most politically powerful Christian city in the world. Constantinople, once the proud capital of the Byzantine Empire, was now ruled by the disgraced Emperor Alexios III, who had recently deposed his brother Isaac II Angelos. The Crusaders' initial goal was to restore Alexios IV, Isaac's son, to the throne, as he had promised to repay their debts and provide assistance for their mission. However, the Byzantine people, already weary of foreign influence, rejected the return of Alexios IV, and Constantinople became a city on the edge of chaos. When Alexios IV was overthrown by a popular revolt, the Crusaders found themselves without a legitimate cause to justify their presence in the city. Still, Their financial debt to the Venetians and their desire for plunder were too great to ignore. With the city now engulfed in political instability, the Crusaders made the fateful decision to sack Constantinople. On April 12, 1204, the Crusaders launched a brutal siege against the Byzantine capital. The walls of Constantinople, which had withstood centuries of invaders, were breached. For 3 days, the Crusaders wreaked havoc, looting the great city, desecrating its sacred spaces, and taking priceless treasures. Hagia Sophia, the crown jewel of Christianity, was plundered, and icons, relics, and manuscripts were stolen, many of which were taken back to Venice. The looting was not limited to material wealth. It was a symbolic destruction of the Byzantine Empire's soul. The immediate consequences of the Fourth Crusade's sack were catastrophic for the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople, once a center of learning, trade, and religious significance, was left in ruins. Cultural landmarks were destroyed or looted, and priceless religious relics were scattered across the Venetian Empire. The Byzantine elite was displaced, many fleeing or being killed, and the empire's once proud intellectual and artistic traditions suffered a devastating blow. For the people of Constantinople, the aftermath was a bitter pill. They watched as their city, their culture, and their faith were desecrated by those who, only decades earlier, had been their Christian brothers. The sense of betrayal was profound. How could fellow Christians, even in the name of a crusade, bring such destruction to the heart of the Christian world? The fall of Constantinople led to the establishment of the Latin Empire, a short-lived political entity controlled by the Crusaders. The Byzantine Empire, however, did not disappear entirely. The Byzantines would eventually retake Constantinople in 1261, but the damage was already done. The Latin Empire's occupation left Constantinople a shadow of its former self. The Byzantine Empire, though it would persist for nearly another 2 centuries, would never again reach the heights of its former power. The loss of cultural artifacts, the destruction of artistic treasures, and the weakened morale of the people would have lasting effects on the empire's future. The Fourth Crusade would go down in history as one of the most disastrous episodes for both the Byzantine Empire and Christianity as a whole. It shattered the unity between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholicism, sowing seeds of division that would lead to the Great Schism and ongoing conflicts for centuries. The Byzantine Empire, once a towering figure in the medieval world, lay shattered after the Fourth Crusade in 1204, its capital, Constantinople, stripped of its treasures, its reputation tarnished, and its future uncertain. Yet, in the midst of this devastation, a new chapter began to unfold. From the ashes of Latin occupation and the loss of imperial power, the Komnenos dynasty would rise to lead the Byzantine Empire through a period of remarkable recovery and transformation. Under their rule, the Byzantines would begin the long road to reconstruction, not only rebuilding their cities and infrastructure, but also reclaiming their cultural identity and intellectual legacy. The Komnenos family, with their deep Byzantine roots, had long been part of the imperial aristocracy, but it was under Alexios I Komnenos, reigned 1081 to 1118, that the seeds of recovery were sown. When Alexios I took the throne, the Byzantine Empire was teetering on the brink of collapse, faced with military defeat and internal disarray. However, his strategic military alliances and reforms helped to stabilize the empire and reinforce its borders. Under his leadership, the Byzantines launched successful campaigns to regain territories lost to the Normans, the Pechenegs, and the Seljuks. But the real recovery, the rebuilding of Byzantine power, came with Michael VIII Komnenos, who would lead the effort to recapture Constantinople from the Latin Empire in 1261. marking a pivotal moment in the empire's re-emergence. This victory restored the Byzantine throne to its rightful rulers and set the stage for a period of cultural and economic renaissance. After the Latin sack of Constantinople in 1204, the once vibrant city lay in ruins, its streets strewn with debris, its churches desecrated, and its palaces looted. For the Byzantine people, the task of reconstruction seemed insurmountable. Yet, the Komnenian emperors wasted no time in restoring their capital. Under Michael VIII Komnenos, the Great Palace, which had once been a symbol of imperial grandeur, was meticulously rebuilt. This was more than just the restoration of imperial architecture. It was a symbolic act that marked the return of Byzantine sovereignty and the beginning of the empire's recovery. Reconstruction also extended to the city's fortifications. Constantinople, once the most impregnable city in the world, had been exposed during the Latin occupation. To prevent further sieges, the Komnenian emperors reinforced the city's defensive walls, ensuring that Constantinople would remain the imperial capital and a bastion of Eastern Orthodoxy. But this rebuilding wasn't just physical, it was also cultural. The Byzantine aristocracy took great pride in reviving the classical traditions of Greek and Roman knowledge that had long been preserved in the Byzantine libraries. Scholars returned to the city, and in the monasteries and libraries, the intellectual heart of the empire began to beat again. With the physical rebuilding of the city came an intellectual renaissance. The Byzantine intellectual elite, long dedicated to preserving ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, now set about reclaiming what had been lost during the Latin occupation. Byzantine scholars turned to the works of Aristotle, Plato, and other classical philosophers, translating and preserving these texts for future generations. The Komnenian emperors, particularly Manuel I Komnenos, were keen patrons of the arts and learning, and under their patronage, the empire's intellectual life flourished once more. The restoration of religious life was also critical during this period. The Orthodox Church, though shaken by the Latin occupation, regained its status as the spiritual heart of the empire. Churches, such as Hagia Sophia, were redecorated, and the Byzantine liturgy was reinstated, restoring the faith to its previous glory. One of the most important aspects of the Komnenian recovery was the restoration of Byzantine economic strength. The Byzantines had long been a dominant force in Mediterranean trade, but their loss of Constantinople to the Latins had disrupted commercial routes. Under Michael VIII Komnenos, the Byzantines worked to restore their trade networks, particularly with the Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa. These city-states, eager to benefit from the Byzantine Empire's strategic position, entered into trade agreements that provided the Byzantines with the necessary resources to restore their military and infrastructure. The Byzantine economy, once built on the wealth of Asia Minor and Syria, began to recover as the Byzantines regained access to Mediterranean trade routes. Venetian merchants brought luxury goods, including spices, silk, and precious metals, which helped fund the restoration of Constantinople's defenses and support the imperial court. The Komnenos dynasty presided over a brief but significant recovery of the Byzantine Empire, a period that allowed the empire to reassert its dominance and reclaim its cultural identity. However, despite these efforts, the empire's geopolitical stability was fragile, and the Ottoman threat loomed ever larger on the horizon. The Komnenos emperors provided the Byzantine Empire with a final flourish, a cultural, political, and economic resurgence. But it would not be enough to withstand the Ottoman advances in the centuries to come. The Byzantine Empire would fall to the Ottomans in 1453. But the legacy of the Komnenos dynasty remains as a testament to the imperial spirit and cultural resilience of the Byzantine people. Through their efforts, the Byzantines preserved the classical heritage, religious traditions, and economic power that would later fuel the Renaissance in the West. As the Byzantine Empire continued its slow decline in the 15th century, the winds of change were blowing from the east. A new power had emerged, one that had already begun to reshape the balance of the Mediterranean world. The Ottoman Empire, under the leadership of its young and ambitious ruler, Mehmed II, was poised to bring about the final chapter of the Byzantine Empire, a chapter that would end with the fall of its ancient capital, Constantinople. The conquest of this legendary city, a crossroads of cultures and empires for over 1,000 years, would not only mark the end of an era, but the rise of a new empire, the Ottoman Empire. Born in 1432, Mehmed II ascended to the throne of the Ottoman Empire at a young age. However, it was his visionary leadership and military genius that would define his reign. Mehmed had already established himself as a capable leader, winning battles and consolidating power. But what set him apart from other rulers was his relentless ambition, an ambition that was focused squarely on one monumental goal: the conquest of Constantinople. Mehmed II saw Constantinople not just as a rich prize or a strategic city, but as a symbol of Ottoman greatness. To him, the fall of Constantinople was not simply a matter of military conquest. It was the key to transforming the Ottoman Empire into a dominant power, both politically and culturally, in the Mediterranean and beyond. Constantinople was the heart of the Byzantine Empire, and by capturing it, Mehmed would not only destroy his rivals, but also become the ruler of one of the most influential cities in the world. For Mehmed II, this conquest was also personal. As a child, he had witnessed the strength of the city's fortifications and heard the tales of its ancient glory. He understood that the Byzantine Empire was a shell of its former self, but its capital city remained a proud symbol of resistance to the Ottomans. The fall of Constantinople would be his legacy, and he was determined to seal his place in history as the conqueror of the most legendary city in the world. As Mehmed II set his sights on Constantinople, he knew that capturing the city would not be easy. The Byzantines, though weakened, still held one of the most formidable fortifications in the world. The city's walls, particularly the Theodosian Walls, had withstood centuries of attacks and were considered nearly impregnable. However, Mehmed was not deterred by these obstacles. His military genius lay in his ability to innovate and think beyond traditional tactics. In the years leading up to the siege of Constantinople, Mehmed II spared no expense in preparing his army for the assault. He began by building one of the largest and most powerful armies the world had ever seen. But it was not just the size of his forces that set him apart. It was his innovative strategies and his investment in artillery that would change the course of history. One of Mehmed's greatest innovations was his use of massive cannons, the largest guns ever built at the time. These cannons, capable of firing enormous stone projectiles, would become the cornerstone of the siege. The Ottomans brought in master gunners from Europe to help design and construct the artillery, and Mehmed's engineers worked tirelessly to ensure that the cannons could breach the city's formidable walls. The largest of these cannons, known as the super gun, weighed several tons and could fire stones weighing as much as 600 pounds. But it wasn't just the artillery that made Mehmed's siege preparations so formidable. Mehmed also understood the importance of controlling the waterways around Constantinople. To achieve this, he built a fortress at the Bosphorus, the narrow waterway connecting the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara. The fortress was strategically placed to block any reinforcements or supplies from reaching the city by sea, thereby cutting off Constantinople's access to outside help. This move demonstrated Mehmed's strategic foresight, as he effectively trapped the city from both land and sea. Beyond his military innovations, Mehmed II was also a master of psychological warfare, understanding that Constantinople's defenses were not just physical, but also psychological. Mehmed used a variety of tactics to undermine the resolve of the Byzantine defenders. His propaganda portrayed the siege as a divine will, a battle between the Ottomans and the Byzantines for control of the city's spiritual and political significance. He encouraged his troops to think of the conquest of Constantinople as a sacred mission, a battle not just for territory, but for the future of Islam and the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Mehmed also relied on his vast intelligence network to gather crucial information about the Byzantine defenses. He carefully studied the city's layout, its military weaknesses, and the morale of the defenders. He understood that the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, despite his valiant resistance, was dealing with a city that was outnumbered and increasingly isolated. The emperor's call for help from the west was largely ignored, and the defenders were left with limited resources to hold the city. To further demoralize the defenders, Mehmed employed psychological tactics such as threatening to destroy the city if the defenders did not surrender, all while offering generous terms to those who chose to join his side. Mehmed understood that the siege of Constantinople would be a test of wills, and he used every tool at his disposal to weaken the resolve of the Byzantines. By April 6, 1453, Mehmed II's forces were ready for the final assault. The siege of Constantinople began in earnest, with the Ottoman artillery bombarding the city's walls day and night. The Byzantine defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI, fought bravely, but they were outmatched in both manpower and firepower. The massive cannons, the strength of the Ottoman army, and the blockade of the Bosphorus quickly took their toll on the defenders. Over the course of several weeks, the Ottoman forces tightened their grip on the city. The Byzantines fought back fiercely, but their efforts were futile against the sheer scale of the Ottoman siege machine. As the days wore on, the Byzantines' hopes for outside help faded and their defenses began to crumble. Finally, on May 29, 1453, the Ottoman forces broke through the city's walls, overwhelming the defenders. The sack of Constantinople followed, and the once great capital of the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottomans. The fall of Constantinople was a defining moment in world history. It marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a dominant power in both the Mediterranean and Europe. Mehmed II, now known as Mehmed the Conqueror, had achieved his goal of making Constantinople the new capital of his expanding empire. The city was renamed Istanbul, and under Ottoman rule, it would grow into one of the world's most vibrant cultural and economic centers. Mehmed's conquest of Constantinople had profound implications, not only for the Ottoman Empire, but also for the Christian world. The city's fall marked the end of the Christian Byzantine Empire, the last vestige of the Roman Empire. For the West, it was a wake-up call, prompting a renewed sense of urgency to confront the rising power of the Ottomans. Mehmed II's conquest of Constantinople was a moment of unparalleled military brilliance, fueled by ambition, innovation, and determination. The Ottoman Empire, under his leadership, emerged as the dominant force in the Mediterranean and Europe, and Constantinople, now Istanbul, would serve as the empire's crown jewel for centuries to come. Mehmed's legacy, marked by his military genius, his strategic foresight, and his psychological warfare tactics would echo throughout history as a defining moment in the struggle for power, territory, and influence in the medieval world. As the year 1453 unfolded, the once mighty Byzantine Empire found itself cornered by the relentless might of the Ottoman Empire. The majestic city of Constantinople, the heart of Christian orthodoxy and the last vestige of the Roman Empire, stood defiant but vulnerable. Its walls, which had held firm for over a millennium, would now face an unprecedented assault that would shatter its defences and bring an end to an era that spanned more than 1,000 years. At the helm of the Ottoman forces was the young and determined Mehmed II, whose ambition to conquer Constantinople had been years in the making. The final siege of Constantinople would not only mark the end of the Byzantine Empire, but also signal the beginning of a new age in the Mediterranean and Europe. The city's fall was not just a military conquest, it was a collision of empires, a clash of faiths, and a turning point in world history. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 was unlike any siege before it, due in large part to the sheer firepower employed by Mehmed II and his forces. At the core of his military innovation was the introduction of massive artillery, the likes of which had never been seen in the history of siege warfare. The most infamous of these cannons was the gargantuan supergun designed by the Hungarian engineer Urban. These colossal pieces of artillery, capable of firing massive stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds, had a profound impact on the siege's outcome. Urban's cannon, which stood at over 27 feet in length and required 70 oxen to move, was the largest siege weapon of its time. Its primary purpose was to breach the Theodosian Walls, the formidable fortifications that had withstood centuries of invasions. Each shot from these massive guns sent tremors through the city's ancient walls, and the deafening roar of the cannons could be heard for miles, a grim reminder of the Ottoman determination to bring down the last stronghold of the Byzantine Empire. The use of such artillery marked a decisive shift in the nature of siege warfare. While traditional sieges had relied on battering rams, siege towers, and starvation tactics, Mehmed's artillery bombardment demonstrated the overwhelming power of gunpowder technology. The relentless pounding of the Theodosian Walls by Mehmed's cannons created gaps in the city's defences, forcing the Byzantines to resort to desperate measures to hold the line. At the heart of the Byzantine defence was Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, a ruler who stood steadfast in the face of almost certain defeat. Constantine, known for his courage and determination, had inherited the crown of a fractured and weakened empire. By 1453, the Byzantines had lost much of their territory to the advancing Ottomans, and the city's population had dwindled. Still, Constantine XI refused to abandon his people. He had no illusions about the dire situation. Constantinople was surrounded by an impenetrable Ottoman force, and his army was vastly outnumbered. But his resolve and leadership would inspire the defenders to hold out against impossible odds. With only 7,000 men to defend the city against a siege force of 80,000 Ottoman soldiers, Constantine XI organized a defense that would become legendary. He rallied the citizens, urging them to take up arms and fight for their city and their faith. Despite the overwhelming threat posed by Mehmed's forces, Constantine's leadership offered a glimmer of hope to the people of Constantinople, who had long viewed the city's walls as an impregnable defense against the world's armies. Constantine XI's greatest challenge was not just the Ottoman military might, but the psychological toll that the siege took on the defenders. The endless bombardment, the uncertainty of outside aid, and the sight of the walls crumbling day by day caused morale to falter. But Constantine's leadership never wavered. He would lead his troops in the final stand, fighting to the end, even as the city's defenses were broken. One of the most tragic elements of the fall of Constantinople was the betrayal by the Venetian and Genoese merchants, whose loyalty to the Byzantines had long been in question. While the Byzantines had sought support from their Western Christian allies in the face of the Ottoman threat, the response from Venice and Genoa, the two most powerful maritime republics in the Mediterranean, was far from what they had hoped. Despite promises of assistance, neither Venetians nor Genoese provided the needed reinforcements or supplies that Constantine XI had desperately sought. The Venetians, in particular, were more interested in maintaining their commercial relations with the Ottomans than in supporting the embattled Byzantine Empire. The failure of these supposed allies to provide meaningful support left the Byzantines even more isolated, with no significant aid coming from the West. This betrayal by Western powers was a harsh reminder of the divisions between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, which had been building for centuries. The Great Schism, which had formally split Christianity in 1054, left the Byzantines to fend for themselves against the rising power of the Ottomans, while the Catholic West seemed indifferent to their fate. This lack of support from Venetians and Genoese merchants contributed to the inevitable fall of the city and the shattered hopes of a unified Christendom. As the siege wore on, the final moments of Constantinople became a harrowing and tragic affair. The Theodosian Walls, which had withstood centuries of invaders, finally began to crumble under the weight of Mehmed's relentless artillery. On the night of May 28, 1453, the Ottoman forces launched their final assault. The Byzantine defenders, though outnumbered and exhausted, put up a fierce resistance. Constantine XI, in a final act of defiance, led his men into battle, rallying them for one last stand. The city, once the heart of the Roman Empire, was now in its death throes. As the Ottomans breached the walls, the defenders fought tooth and nail to protect the sacred city that had been the center of their world for centuries. The last moments of the siege were marked by chaos and bloodshed. The Ottoman forces poured into the city, and as the Byzantine defenders were overwhelmed, the sack of Constantinople began. Looting, massacres, and destruction followed as the Ottoman army claimed their prize. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church of the Byzantine Empire, was transformed into a mosque symbolizing the end of the Christian era in the city. With the fall of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire was no more. The Roman Empire, which had spanned more than 1,000 years, came to an end on May 29, 1453. The Ottoman Empire emerged victorious, and the city of Constantinople, now Istanbul, became the new capital of the Ottoman world. For the Byzantine people, the fall of their beloved city was a deep, spiritual wound. The Orthodox Christian world had lost its center, and the dream of a unified Christian empire lay in ruins. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through the Christian West, prompting the Renaissance in Italy and the age of exploration across the seas. Yet, for Mehmed II, the fall of Constantinople was the fulfillment of his vision, a vision that saw him not only as a conqueror, but as the inheritor of the legacy of Rome. His conquest would secure the Ottoman Empire's dominance over the Mediterranean for centuries to come. The fall of Constantinople remains one of the most pivotal events in world history. It marked the end of the medieval period, the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, and the rise of the Ottomans. The cultural and intellectual legacy of Constantinople, the heart of Byzantine civilization, would not be lost. as it was absorbed into the Ottoman world and preserved for future generations. The fall of Constantinople was not merely the end of a city, but the end of an era, a final chapter in the history of the Roman Empire that began in the ancient days of Rome itself. It was a tragedy, a military triumph, and a cultural watershed, shaping the world that followed in profound ways. The fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, marked the end of a chapter that had spanned over 1,000 years, and with it, the end of the Byzantine Empire, the last vestige of the mighty Roman Empire. But even as the city's gates were breached and the Ottoman Empire claimed its prize, the legacy of Constantinople was far from extinguished. It lived on in the architectural grandeur, the cultural influence, and the religious traditions that had flourished in the city for centuries. Its impact would continue to reverberate through the world for centuries to come, influencing both Eastern and Western civilizations long after its fall. Constantinople had always been more than just a political and military capital. It was a symbol of human achievement, particularly in architecture and art. The Hagia Sophia, completed in 537 CE, stood as the greatest architectural wonder of the Byzantine world. Its massive dome, a feat of engineering, became the epitome of Byzantine architecture. When the Ottomans seized the city in 1453, they would preserve Hagia Sophia not as a Christian cathedral, but as a mosque, ensuring its survival for centuries to come. Today, the structure still stands as one of the world's most iconic buildings, a testament to the creative genius of the Byzantine Empire. Beyond its buildings, Constantinople was also a hub of culture. The Byzantine Empire preserved and expanded upon the classical knowledge of Greece and Rome, making it a vital intellectual center for the Eastern world. Byzantine scholars copied, studied, and interpreted ancient Greek and Roman texts, many of which would later be rediscovered by Western scholars during the Renaissance. Constantinople's libraries, particularly the famous Imperial Library, house priceless manuscripts and texts that would later become a cornerstone for the Renaissance scholars of Italy and beyond. The cultural wealth of Constantinople was unparalleled, and even after its fall, the intellectual currents that flowed through the city continued to shape European thought. It was in the wake of the city's destruction that many of these scholars fled to the West, bringing with them invaluable knowledge of the classical world. This migration of intellectuals had a profound impact on the Renaissance, igniting a rebirth of classical learning and paving the way for new advances in art, science, and philosophy. As the Ottoman Empire claimed Constantinople as its own, the city's fall marked a turning point in world history. The Ottomans quickly established Istanbul as the center of their growing empire, shifting the balance of power in the Mediterranean and beyond. The Ottoman Empire would go on to dominate much of Southeast Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, becoming one of the most formidable empires in history. The fall of Constantinople also had dramatic consequences for global trade. The city had long been a central point in the trade routes connecting the East and West, a crucial crossroads for goods like spices, silk, and precious metals. With the Ottoman rise, the Byzantine control over these routes came to an end, and the Ottomans quickly established their own dominance over trade routes in the Eastern Mediterranean. For Europe, the fall of Constantinople was a shock, and it dramatically shifted the trade routes and patterns of commerce. European merchants, cut off from their traditional routes to the east, began to search for new paths to Asia. This led to the Age of Exploration, as Portugal, Spain, and other European powers began to look westward in search of new trade routes. The discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus in 1492 and the expeditions by Vasco da Gama to India were direct consequences of the changes in global trade. instigated by the fall of Constantinople. Thus, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople did not just reshape the Middle East and Southeast Europe, it indirectly transformed the entire global economy, fostering the rise of European global powers that would come to dominate the world in the centuries that followed. For the Christian world, the fall of Constantinople was nothing short of catastrophic. The Byzantine Empire had long been the protector of Eastern Christianity, and its loss to the Ottomans marked a significant blow to the Christian faith. The Orthodox Church, which had enjoyed its spiritual heart in Constantinople, was forced to contend with the Ottoman rule, which allowed the Orthodox Christians to continue their faith, but under the authority of the Sultan. For the Catholic West, the fall of the city was a wake-up call. For centuries, Constantinople had been a symbol of Christian strength in the East. Its loss left a void in the Christian world, one that would contribute to the division between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, which had already been simmering since the Great Schism of 1054. This spiritual rift would deepen over the centuries, especially as the Ottoman Empire expanded, furthering the split between Eastern and Western Christianity. But even as the Ottomans solidified their control over Constantinople, the city's memory lived on in the hearts of the Christian faithful. For the Eastern Orthodox Church, Constantinople remained a symbol of the Christian struggle against Islam, and the memory of its glory days lived on in religious hymns, prayers, and the continued veneration of its saints. The Roman Catholic Church, though it had been slow to offer meaningful aid to the Byzantines, would also look back on the loss of Constantinople as a tragic moment in Christian history, fueling the Catholic desire to confront the Ottomans in the future. The symbolic importance of Constantinople in both Christian and Islamic traditions cannot be overstated. For Christians, the city had long been a sacred site, the seat of the Eastern Orthodox Church, the home of the Hagia Sophia, and the epicenter of a rich Christian tradition that had endured for more than a millennium. With its fall, Christianity in the East entered a new phase, as Orthodoxy was now under Ottoman rule, though the faith remained resilient for centuries to come. For the Ottomans, Constantinople represented much more than a military conquest. It was a symbolic victory, the end of Christian dominance in the East, and the establishment of Islam as the dominant faith in the region. Mehmed II, who had long dreamed of capturing the city, would go on to reconfigure Constantinople as the new Ottoman capital, renaming it Istanbul and turning the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. This act was not merely a symbol of conquest, but a statement of the Ottoman Empire's dominance in the region, with Islam now firmly entrenched at the heart of the former Byzantine Empire. Even as the Ottoman Empire expanded, the memory of Constantinople as the center of Eastern Christianity continued to inspire both Christians and Muslims for centuries. For Muslims, it was a symbol of Islamic triumph and the beginning of an empire that would span continents. For Christians, it remained a poignant reminder of the enduring strength of the Byzantine legacy and the dreams of restoration that persisted long after the empire's fall. Thank you for watching this story until the end. If you found this one captivating, you're in for a treat with the next one. It's just as fascinating, if not more, than you could ever imagine. Don't miss out. Click on the image on your screen now to dive into the next adventure.